Hello and welcome to this exclusive ADBA video podcast brought to you as part of Net Zero Week 2024 and of course ahead of the World Biogas Expo 2024 later this week. I'm Rob Cockerill and I'm the Global Content Director for Gasworld, and I'm delighted to say that I'm joined here by Chris Huhne, Chair of ADBA, the Anaerobic, Digestion and Bioresources Association. Chris was the UK's Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change from 2010 to 2012, responsible for electricity market reform, energy company obligation, COP negotiations, and the renewable heat incentive. Before politics, he was Chief Economist and Managing Director of Fitch Ratings, in charge of sovereign analysis and an award-winning economic journalist. As a consultant since 2013, he has specialized in dispatchable renewables, notably biogas and biomass. He brings all of this context and expertise to his role at ADBA, which I should remind you is the trade association for biogas developers and operators. Chris, welcome to this special podcast.
Thanks, Rob. Good to be here.
Fantastic to have you with us. Now, I say special because it's not only Net Zero Week 2024, it's been a hugely significant few days here in the UK with the general election, of course, and the dawn of a new Labour government. So, Chris, perhaps we should begin with some initial reflections. We've had the weekend to recap this landslide Labour victory. What are your thoughts on the result and the Labour government that we can look forward to, on paper at least?
Well, I think that the sector will welcome the new government, rather like the vast majority of people in the country. This was clearly an election that was in some ways a punishment election, where the country decided it wanted a change of government. It wanted to get rid of the Conservatives after a very long period in government and lots of problems, which people will remember from COVID and Partygate and the change of personnel from Prime Minister and Chancellor downwards as a result of Brexit. So all of that had accumulated, and we've ended up with an extraordinary result, which is quite unlike any result that had ever previously been recorded in British electoral history, because the government has got an enormous majority with over 400 seats out of the 650 seat House of Commons. But it's got it with the lowest share of the vote that any government has ever had, getting an overall majority in British electoral history. So it's quite an extraordinary result. It suggests that one of the things that is clearly going to be up for discussion is the electoral system. But it was also, in addition, as a piece of background for the government, it's very clearly on some sort of probation, because it takes a relatively small swing to get back from where we are to having an overall majority for the Conservatives. So despite this massive swing, large numbers of seats are held on very small majorities. So lots of MPs will be very nervous. So those of us who had expected that a large majority would embolden the Labour Party to go quickly, for example, on the climate change agenda, I think that a lot of Labour MPs will be looking at their new majorities and thinking, how do I hold on to this next time? And that those majorities are not of a scale to give them a lot of confidence that they're there other than on a short-term lease rather than a freehold. So it's a very interesting election, an election where I think the overwhelming sentiment was anti the Conservatives rather than pro anybody else, and where I think that the government, despite the size of the majority, is likely to be pretty cautious. However, the good news for the sector, for renewables as a whole, for the climate change agenda, is that it is an absolutely key part of Labour's offering and of Labour's commitments. And in order to keep them honest, not only are the Liberal Democrats back as traditionally the most environmental of the major groups, with 72 MPs, the largest total that they have scored for over a century. But also, the Greens are back with a substantial increase from 1 to 4 in the number of their seats. It sounds tiny, but they have a lot of second places to Labour, particularly in urban areas. And that's another guarantee that the Labour Party is going to want to keep honest when it comes to the climate change agenda. So overall, looking at the results, I would say that this is very good news for the renewable sector, for biogas, given the commitments that Labour has already made to decarbonise the electricity sector by 2030. I don't know anybody, by the way, who actually thinks it can be physically done, but I'm not against a stretch target if it means that people are really working hard to achieve it. And if they get almost there by 2030, that will in itself be a pretty amazing achievement. So good news.
Absolutely, and there are certainly a lot of items in the inbox or the in tray for all of those new MPs and the government as a whole. You've alluded to this already, so let's turn our attention now to AD and to biogas. I think it's fair to say the previous view of biogas from DESNZ and DEC before that was that biogas is nice to have, and as a result, it's been rather overlooked. Is that a fair assessment, and just how wrong is that?
I think it is a fair assessment. That's certainly the assessment that I was getting from officials when I became Secretary of State, and I'm sure that the last time Ed Miliband was Secretary of State, which was immediately before me, that was also the view that he will have had from officials. And the reality is that thanks in part to the support schemes that we have had over the whole period, starting with the 2 electricity support schemes, feed-in tariff, renewable obligation certificates, then moving on to the renewable heat incentive, which incentivized biogas being fed, purified and fed directly into the gas grid as biomethane, and then the green gas support scheme. We've had a big growth of the sector. So last year, for example, the capacity of anaerobic digestion of green gas plants across the UK grew by 17%. So we've shown that we can grow very, very rapidly. And what that actually means now is that even if the sector were to just grow at the slowest projected growth rate that the International Energy Agency has set out globally for the biogas industry, even if we were to grow at that slowest projected growth rate, it'll be much, much quicker if it's at the higher growth rate that the IEA projected, but the slowest growth rate of 8% a year, we would be overtaking the nuclear sector in raw energy terawatt hours produced every year during the 2030s. So, I think that this is something that policymakers are increasingly aware of. They're increasingly aware of the particular flexibility and usefulness of biogas in a net zero world. And therefore, I think we're going to get a lot more support precisely because it is such a perfect renewable. It's a very old renewable, very tried and tested. You know what you're going to get. You can build lots of plants very, very quickly, which you certainly can't do, I'm afraid, with other low carbon sources of energy, such as nuclear. And as a result, it can make a big impact in terms of the Labour Party's agenda of decarbonising the electricity sector by 2030.
As you said, it's certainly a quick win. And I think I'm right in saying that ADBA analysis previously showed that Labour's plans to tackle climate change and the use of renewable power includes key goals that cannot realistically be met without green gas expansion, without bioresources. So, I mean, let's not forget, as you said earlier, it targets zero carbon electricity by 2030, which is certainly a bold ambition. So in that context, what needs to happen now, Chris, and what does a net zero world look like? What can AD and biogas do in that net zero world?
Yeah, well, Rob, just reinforce that. I mean, I think you can get to net zero in a whole load of different ways, providing you don't have the sort of time scale that we've got. We've got a really big ticking clock going on climate change. Methane is very, very powerful. We need to tackle it very quickly. And if the Labour government wants to meet its projection of decarbonising by 2030, it's going to have to build out a lot of low carbon potential electricity backup. Now, in a net zero world, we're not going to be able to rely on unabated fossil gas to provide a lot of the backup for the electricity system. And yet the backup for the electricity system is probably going to be even more crucial than it is now, because electricity is probably going to provide most of our heat. At the moment, it's provided by fossil gas. So if we move from fossil gas to electricity and providing domestic heat, then the whole electricity grid is likely to look more like the gas grid. So the electricity grid, everybody thinks, is tremendously seasonal. It's sort of basically, if you take daily data, it doubles from summer to the peak uses in December to February, when you have sort of dark evenings and people are watching telly and they're, cooking and they're doing their domestic heating. So if you take all of that swing in gas, because gas is providing the heating at the moment, and then you put it into the electricity grid, you get an even bigger swing than the doubling. Basically, the swing in gas use from the summer to the winter is anything from 5, 6, 7-fold, depending on whether you're looking at daily data, much more on hourly data. So you need an enormous amount of built-in spare capacity to keep the lights on in that sort of electricity grid, in that sort of net zero world. And people have traditionally talked about using hydrogen, but hydrogen is really very, very difficult, because it's thermodynamically so inefficient to create it in a green way. You're using a massive amount of electricity to create hydrogen, and that you have to assume that you're going to get the electricity for virtually nothing. So I think that's unrealistic. Whereas biomethane, we can produce currently about 10% of the country's needs. We could meet the vast majority, if not more than needed, in terms of the backup for a net zero electricity grid. And we can do so using an awful lot of existing infrastructure. So we can have big biogas plants using a lot of the organic matter, which is currently not being used in anaerobic digestion and green gas plants. We can produce that all year round. We can store it in facilities like, for example, the Rough facility in gas storage facility in the North Sea, which is an old North Sea fossil gas field. And we can put it in there, and we can put it into the high pressure gas grid, and we can bring it out again and run it through combined cycle gas turbines as backup during those difficult winter months from December to January, when there is peak electricity demand. There is no solar yield whatsoever, because there is no sunshine, there's no daylight, in the pitch of winter from 4 p.m. onwards, 4:30 onwards. So we really need other sources. And sometimes you can go for a couple of weeks without having much yield from wind, even offshore wind, even if we're very well connected with all our friends and neighbors in Europe, which has become a little more difficult as a result of Brexit. But even if we are really well connected there, we're still going to have periods where we need that backup if people go on expecting, as I think they will, that they're going to be able to turn their lights on and off and ensure that they have electricity supply. So biogas has got a fantastically important role in net zero, in being the most economical way of ensuring that we have backup in a net zero world, and that we keep the lights on and we can provide the electricity which people will need for their home heating and indeed for their cooking.
Absolutely. And I think, this week we've got England playing in a semi-final of the European Championships on Wednesday night. It's those kind of examples of that surge on the grid at half time or extra time, when it's not just keeping the lights on, it's putting the kettle on and everything else that goes with it. So very real world example this week. Chris, that's what AD can do in a net zero world, but you've been there, you've been in that sort of hot seat, shall we say. So what would you tell this new Labour government about the key priority uses for biogas in this scenario?
Well, I think the great thing about biogas, one of the great things about biogas and biomethane is that it is so flexible, both in terms of the feedstocks it can be made from. So any organic matter can be rotted, any waste matter can be rotted to create biogas in an anaerobic digestion digester, which is in the absence of oxygen. So it's phenomenally flexible in terms of its feedstocks, and there are masses of feedstocks in agriculture when we come to decarbonize agriculture, which we must, because it's responsible for about 11% of overall UK emissions. So every government has been putting that in the too difficult tray for a long time, and they're going to have to get it out and make sure that there is a solution. And AD is a key part of that solution. But AD is also, as well as being really flexible on its feedstocks, is also really flexible on how it's used. So at the moment, it's used as a transport fuel, biomethane, so that we can, whether as compressed gas or as LNG, we've got long distance haulage being run on biogas. It can be used obviously to substitute for home heating. It can be used to run trams. It can be used to back up CCGTs, as we just discussed, in the electricity system. The whole load of different uses that biogas can be put to, and that's part of the problem. And that's why I think it's important for us to talk about the really key priority for biogas in a net zero world has to be something that really nobody else can do. So if electricity can do some of these other things, if electricity can do more and more, for example, of the transport sector, then biogas can be reserved for the really key thing that only it can do. But what that means in the short term for policymakers is that, frankly, we need as much of this stuff as possible. The more capacity we grow for biogas, it can easily be switched later on to go from transport uses to something else, back to that key priority use of, say, backing up the electricity grid. But we will not have enough feedstocks to be able to do all of the potential uses that everybody would like us to do. So the government is going to have to think hard about what the key priority for biogas is. And I think it will be that backing up of the electricity system. But what that means in the short term is that this is an entirely no regrets option to get as much biogas and biomethane capacity going in the country as possible. That means it can be used for all sorts of different things, because it can later be repurposed to go into the high pressure gas grid and as backup for electricity. We're not going to waste any of it. So I think that the message is get going as fast as possible with as much biogas and biomethane capacity as possible, because nobody is ever going to regret it.
Absolutely. The gas for all seasons, we might say. So we do need a roadmap to realize that. And that's a perfect segue now, Chris. Shall we talk a bit more now about ADBA's 10-point biogas roadmap? I've got it here in front of me, but perhaps you could run us through some of those points in brief and the big takeaways as you see them. And then I'd like to home in on one or two of those areas as well.
Well, I mean, everybody's going to be able to see that on the ADBA website. It's something that we're well publicizing. The key objective is to say, look, the International Energy Agency, which is the most respected of all of the international organizations that look at the sector, suggests that we can grow anything between 8 and 22% a year globally. There's a massive growth going on in the European Union. There's a massive growth going on in the US. The UK needs to catch up. I mean, we have had, to be absolutely frank, the most extraordinarily incompetent series of governments. I can't, beat around the bush, but we actually managed to be the only country in the developed world to produce a plan in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine for energy independence and energy security, which failed to mention biogas and biomethane. I mean, the EU regarded it as one of the 3 key pillars of how they were going to become energy secure and energy independent. In the US, it's been an absolutely key part of the Inflation Reduction Act from Joe Biden. But here in the UK, we actually managed to completely ignore the sector, which is just breathtaking, frankly. Now, there have been strides since that. We've had better governments since the Boris Johnson era, but not, I mean, we're talking about a low threshold there. So things have got better, and we've had a very good, up until the election, junior minister in Lord Callanan, who knew the sector. So I'm not saying it was quite as disastrous as that, but it really does mean we have to motor. And that means that the new government has to relook at the support for the sector in the green gas support scheme. How is it going to make sure we had 17% growth of capacity last year, but that was great. But remember, that reflected investment decisions that were being made 2 to 3 years ago. And there have been a big increase in costs, as everybody knows, from the cost of living. I'm afraid that affects not just the cost of living for us, it also affects the cost of supplies for biogas and biomethane producers. If you're building a new AD plant, you have higher costs when you put the concrete in for the base of the digester, higher costs for the steel, the tubing, everything else. So all of that needs to be taken into account. I am worried that the green gas support scheme is not currently generous enough to support the sort of growth rate that we need. But we can build, this sector can build 1,000 new plants by 2030. It's an ambitious target, but we have had periods in the past in the UK when we've grown by 20% a year and over a sustained period. And if we want to look at the real potential for all of the feedstocks that we've got, the wastes in agriculture, the remaining wastes in the wastewater sewage sector, the remaining waste in food waste. We've got a lot of extra food waste coming on from local authorities, assuming that the government holds to the target which the last government set of having mandatory food waste collection. So we're going to get a lot of extra organic matter, which we can treat, but we need to have the support from the government to make sure that these plants are going to get built. And that's inevitably, I think, means there has to be a bit more flexibility in the support, because until now, with the renewable heat incentive and the green gas support scheme, they've been directed purely at biomethane injected into the grid. Therefore, if you were a long way away from the grid, as a lot of those agricultural feedstocks are in livestock areas in the west of the country, where there is not much of a gas grid, then you actually can't use these feedstocks. So it would be good to go back to include a scheme whereby if you build an AD plant or have a micro AD plant on your dairy farm, for example, you can be rewarded through feeding into the electricity grid, not just the gas grid, or indeed using the electricity yourself. I think another really key thing which the government needs to look at urgently is the fact that AD is the only sector at the moment which is actually being penalized by government mechanisms, because we are treated by the emissions trading scheme as if we were fossil gas. There is no allowance for the fact that this is an entirely biogenic, renewable gas, that if we weren't treating these feedstocks would be releasing methane naturally into the atmosphere. So there's no net addition of methane whatsoever. And that is not allowed for in the current emissions trading scheme. So the first thing the government has to do is to stop doing harm. Stop doing harm. The key problem at the moment is that the government is covering in the emissions trading scheme the biogas sector as if we were producing fossil gas rather than renewable gas. So give us allowances, make sure we're on a level playing field. That would be the biggest short-term ask that we've got. Then look again at the necessary level of support. It may not be very much more than that for some of the bigger plants that we can build, and then we can get motoring on building out. Now, we've got a 10-point plan there. I know, having consulted on schemes, I know how difficult it is for many of our members to actually get permission to build out a plant. So I know one member I was talking to recently had 4 plants in the pipeline. 2 of them were approved by local authorities that actually knew what they were doing, weren't afraid of AD plants. Therefore, they could recognize a good proposal when they saw it. Two were just completely blocked by outright NIMBYism, by not in my backyardism. And, you know, I'm not saying we're exceptional in that. Unfortunately, almost any infrastructure, any energy infrastructure faces this sort of problem. And it's, I have to say, much less with us than it would be for a nuclear plant, for example. But the reality is we need some help. We need some help from government providing official guidance to those local authorities that have not yet okayed an AD plant, to point out how useful they are, that they've been around for a long time, that they can be run perfectly safely, and so forth. So that guidance will help those local authorities that have a planning application for an AD plant from trying to reinvent the wheel by going through everything all over again. We could go further than that and look and see whether the Secretary of State could apply to us at, you know, AD plants at small scale. There's 740 across the UK already. Talking about building another 1,000, you know, these are a relatively small scale, but we could cover them with the provisions on critical infrastructure that already exists within the legislation, with a bit of amendment. That would be another way of doing it. So these are the things that I think that we can speed up the process.
Absolutely, further and faster. We'll come back to some of those support mechanisms shortly, but I said I'd like to zero in on a couple of those points in the roadmap. So let's do that if we may. Point 1, we'll start there. That big build of biogas plants that you talked about. You said yourself we can do this. The key now is delivery. In a previous life, shall we say, you've had prior experience of contracts for difference too. So tell us a bit more about getting this delivery done and why these green gas contracts for difference really can increase energy security.
Well, I think that there are a number of different mechanisms we could use to support the sector. So, you know, one of the obvious ones is rather like the mechanism that already exists in the transport sector. You have a fuel obligation put on big gas suppliers, and they have to have a certain proportion of biogas. But there are potentially lots of biogas sites in smaller areas where often small livestock farmers don't have access to a lot of capital. They may be tenant farmers rather than owning their own land. And they therefore want to finance a biogas plant from bank debt. And if they go to a bank now and they say, give us a loan, the bank will say, well, okay, we'll give you a loan, providing you can give us 10 or 12 years of guaranteed revenues. Now, you know, in principle, you could go to the market and say, okay, I want to sell forward my gas production for 10 or 12 years. And in principle, you could get that as a contract and then go to the bank and get the money. The problem, however, is that it's quite difficult. You can get some bespoke offtake agreements for the gas from particular companies that are looking to go green and so forth, but it isn't a very liquid market. So if you want to roll this out quickly, the obvious way to do is provide some sort of guarantee to developers that will actually give them that long-term guarantee on price. The market will take you out to about 7 years in a fairly liquid market, but not enough to go to the bank and say, I want to be able to borrow money to build the plant. So that's where contracts for difference come in. Contracts for difference are now well used in the offshore wind sector, in the nuclear sector, and they basically set a price for the developer, which the developer can lock into. If the price, the market price, goes above that guaranteed level, then the developer pays the government back money. If the market price goes below that fixed level, then the government pays the developer back. So the developer gets certainty and can go ahead with the plant. The government gets a rather good guarantee that we're not going to go through the same sort of thing that we went through after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where you have enormously high gas prices, and the Treasury has to bankroll vast numbers of consumers to get them through paying their gas bills. Now, that is something that the Treasury can ward against in future by ensuring that there is enough domestic gas and that domestic gas is supported to a substantial degree using these contracts for differences. So contracts for differences are a good, flexible mechanism. We were the pioneers in the UK. I was delighted to be the Secretary of State to introduce them and to really pioneer them with offshore wind. And it's been widely followed in other countries. It's now the preferred scheme, for example, of the European Commission, and it's used elsewhere as well. So I think that we have a familiarity with it, and it could unlock a range of biogas plants, particularly in areas and with feedstocks of an agricultural kind, where you're a bit of away from the gas grid, smaller scale farmers, not with a lot of access to capital, but they need to be able to go to the bank. So that's really the argument for contracts for difference. You could do a lot with supplier obligation as well, as with the transport fuels. We've had a long history in the sector of having different support mechanisms. So we currently have the transport fuels support mechanism. We also have the green gas support mechanism for direct injection into the grid. In order to develop the sector as rapidly as possible and use all of the available feedstocks, the government needs to show that flexibility going forward so that it really can use all the potential that's there in the sector.
Sure, thank you, Chris. That's certainly one mechanism, should we say. Points 7 and 8 also strike me as fundamental to the success and the expedience of realizing this roadmap. They are the easing of local planning and permitting and grid connections. Now, we regularly see planning and permitting cited as a big hurdle in almost all geographies, in fact. And I know that both the Conservatives and Labour had alluded to regional grid stability and local generation as a solution, shall we say, to slow centralised development. Now, it's a Labour government that's getting down to business this morning and indeed over the weekend. So what message do you have around these key pillars of the roadmap? And can we overcome that sort of not in my backyard philosophy that so often plagues new projects?
Well, I think that we've already talked a bit about the way in which we can try and ease the planning process. So that's direct guidance from the government, which will stop local authorities from trying to reinvent the wheel every time they have a proposal for an AD plant. That would help. We've already talked about potentially bringing AD plants in as critical infrastructure within the Secretary of State's ability to okay. I think that we need to be much, much tougher in explaining to people that they can't have all the modern conveniences of life, the ability to switch their lights on and off, their heating on and off at will, without also having some consequences in terms of infrastructure. I mean, you know, in my rather more grumpy moments as Secretary of State, I used to dream about the possibility that, yes, any local authority could certainly ban any energy infrastructure. That's democratic, but they should also accept the consequences, which is that the Secretary of State should be able to take them out of the grid. So if people vote in a local referendum in the local authority that they don't want the gas grid, they don't want the electricity grid, they don't mind if they have to self-generate all of that with all of the unreliability that will go with that, that's fine. But if we want to have a world where we can all switch on our heating, electricity, television, everything else, then we have to accept that we're going to need a lot more infrastructure. So I think that's a key message that the government needs to spell out to NIMBYs. And it's going to have to spell it out also, not just in the energy infrastructure world, but obviously also with housing, because we've been falling short there. So that's really important. On permitting, I think it's a bit easier because, frankly, the problem with permitting has simply been the lack of resource within particularly the Environment Agency, but also Health and Safety Executive, to deal quickly with permitting issues. And so you can increase the cost. Now, I'm aware, clearly, Rachel Reeves, quite rightly, as the new Chancellor, wants to be very, very careful with public spending, and this is not necessarily going to come out of public spending. But in that case, increase the fees. Developers will often be very, very happy to pay the actual costs of getting this thing done, providing that it's done efficiently and quickly. There's nothing worse as a management team if you're attempting to build out 4, 5, 6 new AD plants, to have total uncertainty about how long the whole process is going to take, because the planning process and the permitting process is so variable and can be so demanding in terms of management time. So if we can just make this more certain, more reliable, even if that involves a higher cost up front, which can be predicted, then that will be better, frankly, than the current situation where things can just drag on for years before there's a final decision. And, you know, time is money in business. I mean, often in the public sector, people don't realize that, but time really is money, and management time is serious money. So let's get that sorted, please.
And above all, it's time that we don't have as well. Let's face it, we do not have time to deliberate. This brings me perfectly to another key point in this discussion, and that is the regional AD plants that we do already have and the future jobs creation as outlined in point 4 of the biogas roadmap. Do you know how many Labour seats have AD plants within their constituency or perhaps in the planning for those areas? Because I think ADBA intends to invite all of those newly elected MPs to visit those plants, understand the opportunity they now preside over, and get a grasp of the sheer jobs potential and value creation there is, doesn't it?
Absolutely. We're working on that literally as we speak, so that I hope we'll have a very clear idea of the very large number. There's no doubt, looking at the map, that there's a very large number of Labour constituencies that now have AD plants. Of course, there are some semi-urban and suburban and rural areas that already have AD plants, but that's something that means that there are a lot of Labour MPs who have a direct interest in their own constituencies, in the job opportunities that happen as a result of growing out the AD sector. And we calculate that if we aim for and achieve our 1,000 AD plant target by 2030, we could get 18,000 new skilled green jobs, and right the way across the country. And I think one of the things that's really important to point out that came out actually from the government's own figures in the biomethane consultation in the last year was that AD plants tend to be built in areas which have lower than national average income. So building AD plants is actually a way of leveling the country up. It actually is a positive help to low-income areas to increase the number of skilled jobs and increase their incomes. And of course, you also have the building of the plant over the transitional period. So I don't know any other renewable that can create the sort of impact locally on low-income areas that anaerobic digestion, that the green gas can. So I think it's really important that Labour ministers realise the opportunity that they've got with this particular resource.
Fantastic. And I think that is a really key point that, again, we need to get across the levelling up angle. That's a really good point you raised there, Chris. I'm conscious of the time, but I do have a final couple of questions if we can get into those. I was hoping first that we talk CBAM for a moment, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Labour have spoken about it in the press, but it wasn't specifically in their manifesto. So my question for you is, what do you make of that omission, first and foremost, and what impact would CBAM have on carbon policy and AD, and is it a particularly complex piece of the puzzle to get into place?
Well, the theory behind carbon border adjustment mechanism is irreproachable. I mean, it makes sense. All it's saying is that if you are moving faster than the rest of the world towards a low carbon economy, then those sectors like steel, for example, that are going to have to pay a higher price because decarbonized steel and decarbonized energy is more expensive, should be protected from unfair competition that is coming from jurisdictions that are not moving fast towards decarbonization. So all it's doing is introducing a level playing field to protect our heavy industries in particular against unfair competition. So I think the theory of it is very, very clear and good. My own view is that it's almost inevitable that we're going to have it because the European Union is going to have carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And although we were told very often that we were going to be able to do absolutely everything exactly as we wanted post-Brexit, the reality is that the vast majority of our trade is still with the European Union, and we need to have a comparable system to the European Union in order not to introduce a massive disruption, further disruption, I should say, to the trade between the UK and the EU. So I think that our carbon border adjustment mechanism will be introduced. I think it will be introduced in line with whatever happens in the European Union, because that's going to be the minimally disrupting influence on our trade. I am nervous about the detail of it. It has the potential for being a very complex scheme, and generally public authorities are not great at introducing complex schemes. I think that the greater the degree of complexity in a policy, the greater the likelihood that it will fail. So that would be my nervousness, and I put that on the table for ongoing discussion. We want to try and keep these things as simple as possible if we can. But yes, I think we will have a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and I think it'll be in line with the EU proposals, which are already out there. Well, in fact, it's already being implemented through the data collection stage within the European Union.
And that would be a question I'd have, actually, a follow-on from that, Chris. Not to be too simplistic, but do things just get overly complex and we really need to keep them, like you said, as simple as possible, understood and implement quickly?
Yes. I mean, I totally agree with that. And the policy that we should have continued with would have saved vast amounts of money to the Treasury after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, was the Green Deal, which was building on what the Labour government before 2010 had done on energy saving. Over the period in the Liberal Democrat Conservative coalition from 2010 to 2015, there was further investment in energy saving, and all that came to a grinding halt when the Conservatives got an overall majority in 2015. And as a result, the costs of subsidizing bills was absolutely massive to the Treasury, far more than the savings they made from cutting the green crap, as it was described by David Cameron back in 2015. But one of the difficulties with energy saving was its complexity. And we need to have very clear schemes. Wherever you are in policy, they've got to be schemes that take account of the real world and try and keep it as simple as possible. And I very much agree with that. I think that there's a massive tendency in Whitehall to overdo things because somebody comes along from another department and says, oh, well, that's a great scheme you've got there, but what about these people here? How are they going to fit? And then another twirl, another bit of Baroque stuff is introduced in order to deal with this objection. And then, the end scheme as it is agreed is encrusted with a whole set of exceptions, special measures, and so forth, which make it very, very difficult to operate. So I think there has to be simplicity, and that applies in the regulatory framework as well. There's a very good set of ways of doing this in the Netherlands, where they actually review old regulations just to see whether they can be simplified. And that would be fantastic as well. You keep the objectives of the regulations the same, but can you do it in a simpler way that imposes fewer burdens on business, but reaches the same objective? And we should be going through a regular process with all the regulatory issues of doing that sort of review, just to try and keep it as simple as possible.
Absolutely, that kind of reappraisal seems like exactly the sort of thing we should do to create a supportive environment. And that brings me full circle to close here, really, Chris. I'd like to come back to our earlier point around Labour's commitment to zero carbon electricity by 2030. It's a huge ask. It's a tall order. I think we can all agree. We've already discussed what a net zero world might look like and the role of biogas within that. But in the here and now, we have a pressing matter right in front of us, don't we, with the end of support schemes for CHP plants. Without a continuation of those support schemes, aren't any of those 2030 targets simply bound to fail?
Well, the interesting thing last year in the biogas sector is that the overall capacity of the sector grew in the UK by 17%, as I mentioned. That was because we had a lot of big new plants coming on. Actually, the number of plants fell slightly because we had a number of smaller, older plants fell off the system because they were no longer supported. So we could grow even more rapidly if the government addressed the issues of these legacy plants. And these are plants that were basically built under support mechanisms to support combined heat and power, so electricity generation and the use of heat locally. And they were supported through feed-in tariffs into the electricity grid or renewable obligation certificates with the electricity grid. And there is no ongoing support mechanism for them now. So as they come to the end of their support over the next few years, and some have already started to do so, it's a hard decision for operators. Are they going to keep going or are they going to close down? And the reality is that many of them are deciding to close down simply because they have to upgrade because the equipment is running out, is getting too old, or because there have been increases in regulatory standards in terms of the operation of AD plants, and they have to invest in making sure that they have the necessary equipment and safety measures in place to do that. And if they don't, and there's no ongoing support, they simply close down. So I think that the government does need to look at how we can keep these legacy plants going, because it's a bit crazy. Even if we're going, as I said, the sector expanded because of these big new plants, but even if we're going 2 steps forward, it's a bit crazy to take 1 step back. So let's see if we can stop taking that step back as well by finding ways of getting these legacy plants over the extra investment that they need to continue operating, because that will make it easier for the government to meet the 2030 target.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. And we're at the tail end of our conversation now. So any further concluding thoughts from you?
Well, my one concluding thought is that, I spent a number of years as a strategic advisor to ADBA, to the Green Gas Trade Association, and then got very busy with other things and couldn't continue. But when they came back to me to be chair a couple of years ago in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the gas crisis, and I thought that this is now such a completely compelling argument on the grounds of energy independence and energy security. This is a homegrown gas that substitutes for imports of gas that can provide enormous benefits to the consumer, to the treasury. It's just a complete no-brainer. And I think that the more policymakers look at that and realize the potential of the sector to be a big mainstream contributor to our energy security in a net zero world, the more they will see that we really deserve more attention and more support than we have been getting. We've not talked at all about some of the other benefits of green gas plants, which is creating a zero carbon biofertilizer instead of, for example, a synthetic fertilizer made out of fossil gas. But there are a load of other benefits as well, which flow into the circular economy and helping to monetize those for developers in a world, I hope, where we're looking at a decarbonisation plan for agriculture would be really, really good. So I'm totally convinced that green gas has a key part to play in our net zero future. It's just a question of how quickly we can get there. And if the government looks at our 10-point plan and dusts off some of those proposals, all of those proposals, ideally, we can really motor the sector can deliver. We can make a big impact, and we can make a big impact on one of the worst greenhouse gases, which is methane. Methane is much more powerful than carbon dioxide. So the climate change benefits of dealing with methane are much more powerful and much more short-term. So you can have short-term gains when it comes to energy independence, short-term gains when it comes to protecting the consumer, short-term gains when it comes to cleaning up the sewage that is run into our rivers and waterways, and short-term benefits in terms of climate change. What's not to like?
Fantastic. Well, let's see if we can reconvene to talk through some of those other points we haven't been able to discuss today in the next few months. In the meantime, thank you once again, Chris. On that note, it is now time to draw this interview to a close, and very much time for our newly elected leaders to confront the many, many challenges in front of them. We hope that if the Labour Party has a 100-day plan in place, then many of the points we've discussed here are very much within that or become a part of that plan. Because it's clear from what we've heard here that Labour's commitment to zero carbon electricity by 2030 cannot be delivered without it. Thank you for your time. You've been watching and listening to an interview with Chris Huhne, Chair of the Anaerobic Digestion and Bioresources Association, for Net Zero Week 2024.
Thank you, Rob.